morning. This is inDialog and I'm Jaya. Straddling two different careers seemingly effortlessly, Shashi Tharoor's career as a writer has received several accolades, including the Commonwealth Writers' Prize. He has written 6 novels, including the India from Midnight to Millennium, the great Indian novel, Show Business, and most recently, Riot. He regularly contributes to the Washington Post and New York Times. His books seem to indicate a man who is analytical and philosophical, but beset by the problems and the political climate in India. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Shashi Tharoor. Good morning, Shashi.
Good to be here.
Riot is a book that has been recently published. It's based on some factual incidences that occurred. I think it was the Amy Bill case of the woman who got shot and stabbed during the riots in South Africa. What prompted you to write this book from that incident?
Well, that incident was only one catalyzing factor. And my concerns in this novel as an Indian writer go back to my concerns that I've expressed in a lot of my non-fictional writing, in my last book, India from Midnight to the Millennium, and in my newspaper columns in India for the Indian Express and lately for the Hindu, where I have talked about my concerns about India's plural identity, the importance of preserving the diversity that I see as our greatest strength, and to battling the forces of bigotry, or what we in India call communalism. So I wanted to find a fictional way of exploring what happens when hatred is unleashed by one group upon another, or groups mutually against each other. And in turning to that, I was inspired by 2 specific things. One was the account of a riot sent to me by a dear friend who happened to be a district magistrate in a town that suffered a riot in India. And the other was indeed the stark image of the American girl who was killed in South Africa by the very blacks whom she had gone to help, who killed her merely because of her appearance. And the 2 images sort of merged and fused in my mind, and Riot was born. But it's neither about South Africa, nor is it a non-fiction account of a particular riot. I use these elements, which suggest some things to me, to in fact explore a much larger picture of a certain communal problem in India in the late 1980s through the lives of a small group of individuals. The American girl who goes to India, the district magistrate with whom she falls in love, his friend, the superintendent of police, and the voices of a Hindu chauvinist leader, a Muslim historian of a certain kind of bent, and the parents of Priscilla, who later come to India to see where their daughter lived and died, and whose own voices are an important part of the mosaic of experiences that the book depicts.
This book is a departure from your usual style, where you've used transcripts of interviews, excerpts from diaries, etc. Why did you pick this style of writing?
Well, I always believe the word novel implies an obligation to do something new each time. Each of my novels has had some sort of an experiment with narrative form. In the great Indian novel, I took the Mahabharata and I took 20th century Indian history, and I reinvented both as a sort of satirical novel of 20th century India in a kind of mock epic style. In my next novel, Show Business, I experimented with intercutting narratives, where you had a narrative, a monologue by the principal character reflecting back on his own life and episodes in his life. You had the story full of tongue-in-cheek lyrics and other sorts of jokes of the formulaic Bollywood film in which he, as an actor, along with other characters in the novel, was acting. And you had a third kind of narrative, that is, narrative addressed to him while he lies on his hospital bed by these characters in his life. And these 3 intercutting narratives gave you an unusual style as well. So I've always enjoyed experimenting with it, because I've always believed that the way in which a tale is told is often as much of an experience of pleasure or satisfaction for the reader as the story itself. You know, one can tell stories in many ways, but one of the magical advantages of the printed word is that you can do all sorts of things. You can hop around time and space in ways that you can't do on the stage so easily, for example. And I thought it would be fun to try and do that. With this book, I felt it was very important to have different points of view. It is, after all, a novel about collisions of various sorts. Collisions of cultures, collisions of philosophies, collisions of ideas, collisions of religions, collisions of individuals. And so to have different perspectives, each valid for itself, each with its own integrity, was an important way of trying to portray the sort of fragmented reality that the novel is all about.
You also introduced an American girl, like we said before, unlike most of your other books, which have been purely Indian. Was there a particular purpose to this, or?
Well, in this particular case, I thought it was useful to have an outsider come in, because through her own explanations and to some degree her own incomprehension, you get an important element in the plot, but also because it sometimes helps, I think, for any group of people to see themselves as others might see them. An outside perspective is often very helpful in our own self-examination. I also wanted to play with perspective. I mean, to take a different example, not the lead female character, but her mother is the one person through whom we see the town of Zalilgarh in which they live. And what's interesting there is not only did I have to imagine these characters, I had to enter into their imaginations. That is, I wouldn't just have to describe a town like so many dusty small Indian towns that I have seen, but to ask myself, what would an American woman of a certain age, of a certain disposition, notice in a town like this, and then try to describe those things.
Would you be kind enough to read a section from the book Riot? I think it's page 205.
Yeah, we talked about this. It's a comment made by Priscilla's father, Rudyard Hart, who has actually been in India earlier trying to market Coke, and had left after having failed when Coke was asked to leave the country. And he comes back after all that's happened, and he's talking to a historian, and he says, "I'll tell you what your problem is in India. You have too much history, far more than you can use peacefully. So you end up wielding history like a battle axe against each other. Whereas we at Coke don't care about history. We'll sell you our drinks whatever your history is. We don't worry too much about the past. It's your future we want to be a part of."
Yeah.
Riot is a novel which, gosh, there's a lot I can tell you about. Maybe one way I can start is to show you two faces of the same novel in the shape of the two jackets of the book, the Indian edition and the American edition. I've just come from launching the Indian edition, and I'm here to talk about the American edition, which is just at book stands. You've all seen this, I hope. It's one of these lovely covers that Americans do so well. The Rajasthani fretwork. There's this lovely picture in the middle of the sun setting over a Mughal monument, the elegiac vision of India. And the Indian edition, and of course I should have mentioned, it has the subtitle on the cover, a love story. And then you have the Indian edition, which looks like that. An actual photograph from a real riot, with cars overturned and smoke and flames rising from something, someone lying burned in the ground, people standing about in ornaments to the fashion of the back. And that subtitle is not there. Because Riot, in one sense, is really two novels in one. It's a love story and a hate story. And it's a story as much about how people define themselves in terms of what makes groups hate one another.
Tell me about some significant event in your life while growing up in India that shaped you as a person.
I don't think I'd pick up any one particular event. You know, we're all shaped by a whole continuum of experiences, where we live, what we hear, the friendships we have, the experiences we have. I mean, in my own case, I have to say that probably one of the defining things was my childhood asthma. I was a terrible sufferer. And it shaped me in some ways, including perhaps in driving me to writing, because as a small kid, suffering from asthma, frequently bedridden, no TV in Bombay in those days, no computer games, and no other distractions. All I had were books and pen and paper. And so ultimately, I became a writer in a sense, as a way of amusing myself and keeping myself going at a time when I was chronically ill. That was also a tremendously character-building experience, because, you know, going to school when you're ill, taking exams when you're wheezing, all of that stuff really toughens you up in some ways, and I will say that probably helped both determine the direction of my favorite avocations and my ultimate, you know, determination to do certain things. Who knows, if I hadn't been sick, I might have wasted all my time playing cricket instead, which was my real passion, but I just wasn't well enough to do it.
Do you still watch cricket?
When I can, yes. It's been my misfortune to have spent my entire adult life in countries where no serious cricket is played. I came to graduate school in the US at the age of 19. I then lived in Geneva, Switzerland, in Singapore in Southeast Asia, in Geneva again, and then in New York, all of which are places where you don't really see TV cricket very easily, either, you know, in real life or on the screen. when I go to India or to England, I try and watch cricket. But even the days when I used to get friends, or my late father before that, to send me cassettes of matches taped from their TV screens in their countries, those days are over because I don't have time to watch those cassettes when they come.
What age did you start writing for publications?
I started writing, not for publication, but just for myself, around age 6, believe it or not.
Oh.
But I was first published at the age of 10, and I even wrote a so-called novel. I mean, now looking back on it, it's not really much of a novel, but it was serialized in 6 installments, with the first one being a week before my 11th birthday. So I had early on the addiction of seeing my name in print. And throughout my school days, I kept writing evenings and weekends. And I would say that by the time I left India to come to the States, I had probably appeared in print in every single English language newspaper or magazine in India, from the Illustrated Weekly of India to Eve's Weekly, writing everything from fiction to non-fiction. It simply was my one form of self-expression. So it was also a valuable apprenticeship, because the more you write, the better you get at it. You learn what you can do well, what you're not doing so well. And of course, writing for publication means you get feedback all the time. I was writing for publications my neighbors and friends were reading, so I was hearing reactions all the time. What worked, what didn't work was fabulously interesting for me.
The story goes that you've even written a couple of romances for Eve's Weekly.
That's right. There were a couple of romantic short stories. I'm not even sure whether Eve's Weekly can be found anymore. Well, the archives still have them and one can trace them. But I have a couple or at least one, maybe 2 romantic short stories. I also did some tongue-in-cheek pieces for them, which were not particularly romantic, just sort of jokey sorts of essays. So not everything I wrote for Eve's Weekly was about romance. But when an 11-year-old or 13-year-old boy tries to write about romance, I think you can throw realism out the window. Yeah.
So what do you think of the genre of romances?
Well, I haven't really gone back to it then since those 2 stories in Eve's Weekly. I really haven't read much, so I can't tell you credibly that I know enough to comment on romances.
I read the great Indian novel along with India, Midnight to Millennium, back to back, and I thought one sort of led from the other. Did you get your idea of writing the India, Midnight to Millennium from the previous book?
No, there's a gap of about 8 years between them.
Oh, is that right?
In terms of publication. The Great Indian Novel came out in 1989, and India from Midnight to the Millennium was published to coincide with the 50th anniversary of India's independence in 1997. But I'm glad to see that you felt a certain integrity of vision there, because I do have, obviously, a number of concerns about India, which I try to manifest in both my fiction and my non-fiction. Above all, I see India in a very strong way as a pan-Indian view. I don't want India to be reduced to narrow particularisms, narrow bigotries. Instead, I have a vision of India, which is, in that sense, very much like the vision articulated by our great nationalist heroes, particularly Pandit Nehru, of a land which in many ways is greater than the sum of its parts, a land which embodies an idea that incorporates diversity and civilization.
Can we read a section from it? I think it's...
Well, I think we talked about the small bit when I speak about my children's view of who they are.
Yes.
And it says, I have twin sons born in June 1984. Though they first entered the world in Singapore, and though the circumstances of my life have seen them grow up in Switzerland and then the United States, it is India they've always identified with. Ask them what they are, and that's what they'll tell you. They're Indian. Not Hindu, not Malayali, not Nair, not Calcuttan, though they could claim all those labels too. Their mother is as herself half Bengali and half Kashmiri, which gives them further permutative possibilities. They desire none. They are just Indian.
But do you think it's easier for an Indian living abroad to consider himself or herself as an Indian rather than a person living in India, where you go by what you are, like a Madras, a Tamilian or a Malayali or whatever?
Well, I don't think that I'm unique in my very strong conviction of a pan-Indian identity. Certainly it helped that I am ethnically from Kerala, where my parents were both born, that I myself was born in London, went to school in Bombay, high school in Calcutta, college in Delhi. I have friends all over the country. And so in that sense, yes, I do have a sense very much of my experience of India straddling the entire country, which I recognize is not true of that many people. But at the same time, I do believe there is a sense of India that most people carry with them, certainly most educated people carry with them, a sense that goes well beyond the specific details of their town or their village or their caste or their religion. And that is the vision that I keep holding up as what unites us all. I've often said that if America is a melting pot, then India is a thali. In other words, that you look at a plate with a collection of different bowls with different dishes in them, which don't necessarily mix with the next, because the bowls prevent each dish from flowing into the other. And in that sense, too, in India, we have all these different identities. But in the thali, nonetheless, you eat everything on the thali and it combines on your palate to give you a satisfying meal. And that too is the Indian experience. You may have very clear and obvious distinctions between a Tamil and a Haryanvi, or between a Bengali and a Punjabi, but ultimately we're all on the same plate together. And ultimately the combination is what makes India India.
Your twin sons, how old are they now?
They're 17 and they're sort of gearing up for college. I mean, this is the final stage when they're beginning to put their applications together.
Will they ever consider going into diplomatic service?
They tell me the one thing they never want to do is work for the United Nations. But, you know, who knows? When they were very young and extremely militaristic, as all 80-year-olds tend to be, they said, but why is the UN for peace? War is much more fun.
Yeah.
Now, of course, they've outgrown that, and now they're very much for peace. After the tragic events in the 11th of September, they were out there in Union Square in New York lighting candles with all the peace lovers. So who knows how their thinking is going to evolve. But as of this moment, they don't know what they want to do, they just know what they don't want to do, and they don't want to follow in my footsteps.
What about writing?
They're both touchwood very gifted writers. Ishan and Kanishka are in fact the joint editors-in-chief of their high school newspaper.
Oh.
Normally only one editor-in-chief is appointed, but they've both done pretty much every job in the school newspaper, you know, news editor, features editor, managing editor, whatever. So they were both invited to be the joint editors-in-chief. And that is a gift they have, which I think if they worked a little harder, they could do much more with it. They have reviewed books for the Milwaukee Sentinel Journal at the invitation of the books editor there. They have written dispatches for the Calcutta Telegraph, where they interned this summer. And after the World Trade Center tragedy, they wrote for this Calcutta newspaper about their experiences.
Do you think writing is a way of life, or do you think you can sort of learn it as you go along?
I've never been a great believer in learning how to write. I do believe it comes fairly instinctively. Certainly in my case it does. And I believe those who think you can write to a formula are writing things that by and large are not worth reading.
Has Kofi Annan read any of your books?
Well, he tells me he has. No, he has very little time these days, but when the Great Indian Novel came out, he had a little more time. He wasn't yet Secretary General, and he not only read it, he was generous enough to present it to two successive American ambassadors to India, Frank Wisner and Tom Pickering, who happened to be friends of his, and he made sure that each of them left with a copy of the book. So I would say that he's not only been a fan, but he's been supportive. I mean, thereafter, of course, he's been very busy. I tend to joke that there is no truth in the rumor that when asked, have you read Shashi Tharoor's last book, he said, I certainly hope so.
You still carry an Indian passport. What does it signify?
To me, it signifies who I am. You know, I was born in London. I am eligible to have a British passport. But I grew up in India, and it's everything that I am and believe and so on was shaped by the experience of growing up in India. My formative years from about 2.5 to about 19.5 were in India. And to me, the Indian experience is so important because of not just what it's made of me, which would be a very narcissistic way of looking at it, but because of what India stands for, I think, in the world as a whole. A society that has managed to transcend differences of caste, color, culture, cuisine, custom, costume, conviction, and still rally around a consensus, a democratic consensus that basically says it doesn't matter if you don't agree on everything, so long as you agree on the basic ground rules of how you will disagree. That's how we've constructed our society. It's a wonderful experiment in the world. I think it's one which, to me, is so important for the world at large that we can preserve this kind of diversity and tolerance and the importance of coexistence amongst people who don't look like each other, don't sound like each other, don't eat the same kinds of food. If we can do that in India, it augurs very well for the world as a whole.
Do you think it's a defection of sorts if you do pick up an American citizenship?
No, I wouldn't say that. I certainly am not one of those self-righteous people who argue that my way of doing things is the only right way. I'm sorry to say there are many people with an Indian passport who are disloyal to India, and there are many people who picked up foreign passports for personal reasons who are in many ways fundamentally Indian to the core, perhaps more so than some of us who have Indian passports. So I wouldn't say that a passport is a proof of anything. But I do believe that NRIs, as we call them, the non-resident Indians, are of various kinds. In my book, India from Midnight to the Millennium, I've asked, should NRI stand for not really Indian or never relinquished India? And I think there's a bit of the never relinquished India in all of us, certainly in me. So for me, it so happens that I work in America as I worked in Geneva, as I worked in Singapore, because my job puts me here. I have not made the leap of the imagination that emigration entails. I haven't tried to become American. I haven't tried to become Swiss. And if tomorrow Jesse Helms exiles the UN to Africa, I will not become African. You know, it's not that you know, my nationality has changed by the geographical accident of where I'm working. And in that spirit, my Indian passport remains a proud affirmation of my Indianness. But I do not believe at all that those who have, for whatever reason, felt compelled to give up their Indian passport, even for something as simple as the convenience of traveling without a visa, I don't think that those people are necessarily any less entitled to speak of their Indianness than I am.
Name one person who you think has inspired you.
A lot of people have inspired me, but for me, the most important figure in my life has been my late father. Mm-hmm. He had a very, very difficult childhood, lost his father at a young age, really pulled himself by his bootstraps, went to village schools, studied hard, went to England as a young man, worked his way up. He had tremendous people skills, he was deeply loved. He was a very kind and generous man, and a man of great liberal values and principles, which I think in many ways, unconsciously as well as consciously, have been instilled in me. And he's somebody whom I'm constantly you know, looking to for approval. I wanted him to be proud of me, and it's one of my great experiences of loss was losing him at the relatively young age of 63, now almost 8 years ago. And I still think of him very often. It's a loss that, in a sense, when people you're close to pass away from this world, mm-hmm. they're actually always with you, and he is always with me.
Oh, that's beautiful. Lastly, how would you like history to remember you?
Oh, I think it would be extremely presumptuous to assume that history will remember me at all. I think that ultimately, you know, what you do on this planet while you're here has to mean something, because otherwise, you know, why are you here? You have to try and make a difference in some way. If through my work at the UN, whether for refugees early on, in peacekeeping later, in working for Kofi Annan and trying to get the message of the UN's work outside, if all of these things have helped make the world a better place, that is certainly a matter of great satisfaction for me. And then if I can leave behind enough books on the shelves of my grandchildren that will still resonate to later generations, whose ideas, whose values, whose stories still mean something to people later, I'd be very happy that I've spent my time on this earth well.
It's been an immense pleasure, Shashi Tharoor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jaya.